Put it there, boy. We'll show these fascists what a couple of hillbillies can do. Well, I'm going to tell you, fascists, you may be surprised. People in this world are getting organized. You're bound to lose. You fascists bound to lose.
All you fascists bound to lose.
I said,
All you fascists bound to lose.
Oh, sure. So my name's Charles Johnson. I am a left-wing market anarchist. I sort of work with Alliance for Libertarian Left, Center for Stateless Society. I co-edited a book with Gary Chartier called Markets Not Capitalism, which is sort of intended as an introduction to left-wing market anarchist thought. And so I study history and I study dead languages and I talk about sort of radical individualism. Sure, so there's a couple parts here to unpack. There's the market, so I mean really you could do three, right? There's the left and there's the market and there's the anarchism. But let's try and break it down this way. So market anarchism is going to be a view that favors sort of a fully consensual stateless society. So when people hear the word anarchy, they often think of sort of riot or disorder. And there's a reason for that. It's not because the word means that, right? I mean, anarchy just means sort of no, it means sort of lawlessness or no authority. That only means sort of social disorder or social breakdown or violence if you think that the only way to get social order is by means of social control, by means of sort of a state apparatus coercing people to sort of work and live together. Market anarchists argue that this is just a false picture, that what we're for is not sort of violence and disorder, but rather a consensual order, an order that's not based in social control, but rather in sort of horizontal social relationships and voluntary cooperation between people. Market anarchists in particular are radical individualists, so we have the view that sort of one of the paramount values in a stateless social order is going to be sort of individual liberty, right? So the principle is going to be that you have the right and you are sort of free to do anything that you want with your own person, with your own property, so long as it doesn't infringe on the equal right of anybody else to do the same with their person and their property. From this, we envision a society without government, without state, without police or borders or prisons, in which interactions are contractual and consensual between sort of based in people's voluntary agreements, their exercise of individual liberty, and sort of the practice of sort of mutual interaction and socially accountable self-defense if necessary, not on the basis of sort of political organization or a state apparatus. So that's sort of the market anarchism part of things, or sort of the picture of it. Also, so it's market anarchism in particular because one of the individual liberties we think is important is the liberty of property and freedom of trade. The left wing is going to shape a bit what we mean by that and how that looks. And also I'll talk about that in a moment. But so the kind of society we envision is one where people are sort of working for the fruits of their own labor, trading them amongst each other, and sort of building contractual relationships, sort of free competition, entrepreneurial discovery, all these other features of the market form. Now, we identify as left-wing market anarchists in particular because so one of the concerns in contemporary politics that you often have is when people start talking about markets, people instantly think of capitalism. They think of sort of corporate capitalism, sort of Fortune 500 companies, economic production organized through giant sort of top-down structures with a boss at the top and a bunch of employees underneath who have to maintain their relationship with their corporate employer, with their landlord, with other sort of people in the owning class in order for them to be able to make a living. Left-wing market anarchists think that the products of a fully freed market are actually going to look systematically completely different. this. So our model for what healthy markets look like is not so much like, so it's not like the New York stock market, right? It's like the farmer's market. So you can have a society with decentralized individual ownership where people are sort of trading back and forth with each other, but they are sort of making their lives and engaging in relationships and going into marketplaces on a basis of relative equality with each other, where there's much more of an emphasis on there's much more of an emphasis on sort of mutual horizontal relationships rather than big top-down firms where people sort of mostly own the tools and means of production that they need to make a living for themselves, sort of independently or cooperatively with fellow workers. And where what you see is a lot of sort of decentralized structures very different from sort of concentrations of wealth and power in the hands of sort of a few corporations, like sort of Fortune 500 and bailout banks and others that are sort of presented as like the cornerstones of capitalism. They're specifically completely dependent on state support, state bailouts, and state monopoly to maintain their position. And so broadly, left-wing market anarchists are going to be people who think that sort of social and economic goals associated with the left, things like both sort of greater economic equality, also like social and cultural liberation, emancipation. So support for gay liberation, opposition to racism and to sexism, support for environmental sustainability, and so on. These are all things that are important, like left-wing social and economic ends that can be achieved through radically libertarian means, through a stateless society and through grassroots social movements, rather than through like sort of social legislation or kind of political control. So one of the debates that sort of runs a lot between sort of within libertarian circles, and especially when like left-wing market anarchists are sort of arguing for the particular kinds of social ends that we're concerned about, is a question about whether libertarianism is best understood as sort of a thinly specified commitment that's just about sort of very narrowly concerned with sort of individual liberty, size, scope, and power of the state. It's a rigorous application of the non-aggression principle, or whether libertarianism is a thickly conceived commitment, which is sort of based in anti-statism and based in concern for individual liberty, but where people who care about these things, right, who care about sort of individual liberty from coercion, so people who advocate a thick conception of libertarianism argue that so the same reasons that libertarians have to care about individual liberty and to care about sort of trying to safeguard people's rights from invasion by the state are also reasons to care about a number of other, sort of also provide good reasons to care about a number of other things. So if you're concerned about sort of the dignity and liberty of individual people, it's often going to be, and sort of suspicious of state authority, one of the best reasons for this is because you sort of advocate a broad ethic of non-domination or sort of anti-authoritarianism. And so our view is that there's a wide range of sort of cultural and economic issues that aren't just sort of answered by sort of a thin libertarian approach of, let's get rid of the state and it'll take care of itself. But rather where libertarians should, where libertarians, for the reasons that they're libertarians, also have reasons to be concerned about these other sort of non-state forms of oppression or these sort of non-state issues. And so, have good reasons to be concerned about bringing them about, to sort of combat racism, for example, obviously not by promoting government laws that would violate principles of non-aggression, but rather by, in addition to working for principled non-aggression, also working through grassroots social means to try and bring about a more just and equitable society.
What I think is also foundational is left market anarchist conception of property.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I don't know that I have too much interesting to say about it, all told. But so left-wing market anarchists advocate individual ownership of property. Typically, we are we view property ultimately as sort of a function of labor rights, that people work in order to make a living. They voluntarily transact with each other, and people are entitled to sort of the fruits of their own labor that are sort of produced through that. Left-wing market anarchists, like sort of other market anarchists, stress that sort of the availability of individual ownership is going to be really crucial just to giving people sort of the best opportunity to make use of, like tacit and local knowledge, to interact with each other on sort of a basis of relative equality rather than dependence, and that sort of respect for individual property rights is ultimately going to follow from respect for their person. If you're sort of if you're taking or destroying other people's stuff, that's in a way appropriating their labor in a way that is an exercise of domination over other people. Like many other leftists, left-wing market anarchists have a great deal of concern over sort of whether patterns of ownership of property in a society look like something that's generally going to allow people to interact with each other in the marketplace more or less as equals, or whether they're things that are going to create sort of large disparities in social power as they sort of come to negotiate with each other. But unlike state leftists and unlike anti-property anarchists, left-wing market anarchists typically argue that these are sort of questions about disparity of power and sort of large-scale disparities of ownership are things that aren't best handled through a lot of sort of ex-ante restrictions on like the kind of stuff or the amount of stuff that people can own. Rather, they're best handled not through like de jure limits, but through sort of the de facto dynamics. If people are fully free, and if everybody is fully free, so not just like a select class of capitalists who have sort of access to the police and access to the regulatory bureaucracy, access to licensing, but sort of under conditions of total economic freedom, that de facto the main effect of markets without bailouts and monopolies and corporate welfare is a centrifugal effect on wealth and ownership. And so sort of it provides resources for sort of most people, and especially like working people and sort of traditionally socially marginalized people, to get to sort of have their labor better respected, to get sort of access to the advantages of property ownership in marketplaces, and so that sort of the issues of sort of large scale disparity are things that are partly aided by sort of getting the state out of the business of like bulldozing people's homes, for example, or shutting down people's small hair braiding businesses or gypsy cabs or what have you. But also that sort of free people are able to create grassroots mutual aid societies, labor organizations, other sort of civil society organizations where sort of working people can sort of cooperate with each other, and sort of provide alternatives to like sort of very top-down corporate organization, and thus, as I was saying, sort of resolving questions about disparity of ownership through like de facto mechanisms and grassroots organizing and direct action rather than through some kind of ahead-of-time political scheme.
Right. How does this concept of property play into the concept of borders? A lot of people will say, well, if I can own my own property, then the nation can delineate. If I can delineate between my house and my neighbor's house, then the nation can delineate between our nation and the other nation. What do you have to say to that?
Right. So when people argue that the justification for border controls in particular is sort of something like a person's right to like police the entrance of their own house, I mean that's such a weird metaphor ultimately, right? Like people don't own countries. There's nobody who owns the entire continental expanse of the United States. And it's perfectly true that if someone, for whatever reason, has, sort of problems with Mexicans, doesn't want a Mexican in their house, there's nobody who's going to tell them that you have to sort of let people come in against your will. The open borders proposal is that people with sort of nativist sentiments about who they want on their land should stop telling other people who they can and can't have on their property. So I have no problem at all with having immigrants for neighbors. I have no problem at all with sort of trading and working together with immigrants. And this is, when sort of people insist that, like the nation is somehow our house, as if, sort of this thousands and thousands of miles of expanse is something that is owned by the state and that has to be administered by the most belligerently anti-immigrant, most belligerently xenophobic group of the people who live in it, they're attacking my neighbors and they're attacking my property and my, sort of my relationships and my friends and neighbors' relationships with each other. And so sort of a radical respect for property rights really specifically requires complete commitment to open borders. That the only relevant questions about access are questions about whether you're welcome on the specific property that you're on, not like whether I took a vote with sort of everybody else in the city to see if you can do your own work and make a living for yourself. So I don't think it's true that private property necessarily leads to environmental destruction. There is there's a bit of a step back that I want to take here to make sort of an issue clear, which is that the fact that market anarchists defend sort of private property and individual ownership does not by any means mean that market anarchists sort of willy-nilly stand up for the interests of anybody who has something the government calls their property. Right, and so like a classic example of this, which I'll come around to some environmental examples in a sec, but one of the classic examples of this is sort of in debates over intellectual property. So government currently claims that copyright holders, patent holders, have a property right in the ideas that they put out, which allows them to restrict the free copying of published works or of products like pharmaceuticals and other kinds of research-based products. Even though those who are peacefully copying them or peacefully imitating them are not actually taking anything away from the person who claims to be the owner, right? So like if you write a poem and I make a copy of the poem, you didn't lose your copy. There's two of them now instead of one, and you're still able to use your copy just as much as you were before. The difference is now I can use my copy. And so the fact that there's an artificial sort of law-created property claim doesn't mean that there's a genuine moral right to property here. What we see actually is like a government-granted monopoly, one that very heavily privileges like sort of, almost all at the top of the Fortune 500 in particular, sort of provides the business model for many of the largest and most powerful corporations, either their patent portfolios or copyright portfolios, and that also literally kills people because of patent restrictions in particular have killed millions of people around the world through artificial inflation of drug prices, especially HIV/AIDS drugs. This is one along with closing of borders. It's actually one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes that the state has imposed just within the last couple decades. Now, so let's take that and talk a bit about the environmental issue. So the fact that, for example, a coal company came in to the hills and sort of managed to finagle a deal with the local government that says like they own a whole mountaintop, for example, which they never lived on. They haven't worked until they sort of brought the bulldozers in, and that has a lot of people sort of living around it and making use of natural resources like streams and the air quality and the soil quality and so on. The fact that government says that the coal company owns it doesn't mean that this is actually a genuine property claim, rather than just sort of a privilege that's granted to the coal company politically. And so there are certainly sort of any society that has humans in it and building things is going to have live issues of environmental sustainability that we have to genuinely care about and try and address through grassroots means. But one of the core features of the environmental crises that we face today is typically that they deal with extraction of natural resources in an environment where corporations and government work closely together to monopolize the use of resources and to insulate sort of the extracting operation from sort of the consequences or the costs that they're inflicting on everybody else around them. So with mountaintop removal, we have sort of destruction of communities through ruining their water sources, for example. I used to live out in Las Vegas, as part of a state that's about 75 to 80% owned by the federal government, right? And virtually all resource extraction issues in the state of Nevada have to do with Bureau of Land Management or other branches of the federal government sort of leasing out natural gas and other natural resource extraction rights to mining operations. And so the problem here is actually not sort of small-scale individual ownership of property. It's not like ownership of natural resources. The problem is corporate ownership of natural resources and government ownership, especially with sort of combined with sort of the incentives that provides for them to make it available to irresponsible extractive industry. It's the same thing with the Great Deal Forest Defense, that sort of the clear-cutting crisis of the 1980s and 1990s especially was driven by policies within national forests in particular, subsidies to they build logging roads for logging corporations, literally like at a loss for what they were getting back, but because it's state ownership, they don't have any incentive to sort of care about the costs that are being inflicted. That's somebody else's problem. What they care about is that they have a close political relationship with the major logging companies, or with the mining companies in the Southwest, or with the mountaintop removal mining companies in Appalachia. And so their political incentives all say, like, cut a deal with these guys. They'll help grease the wheels. When you get out, you may get a job with the company through sort of the standard revolving door. And the one thing that could really help resolve this problem is to make make the corporations that are claiming the privilege to extract natural resources from these sensitive environments actually accountable to the other people whose sort of lives and livelihoods and land they're wrecking, rather than sort of allowing sort of anything that the federal government and BLM will sign off on. So the question is what the status of intellectual property is. And it's absolutely true that intellectual products take labor to produce. And so advocates of intellectual property always just try and short-circuit the argument there. So like, I've worked really hard on this poem, so you can't just take that away from me. And I agree, I can't just grab your poem away from you. But if you read out your poem and I write it down, I haven't grabbed anything away from you. So the claim is that sort of ownership of intellectual property not only gives you sort of control over the disposition of your own voice, your own pen, your own paper, your own copies of the things that you produce, but that also it gives you a right of disposition and a right of veto, and a right to sort of extract fees from other people's voices, their pens, their sort of creativity and products, if in some way that's like contacted an idea of yours. Even though, so that can mean like direct duplication, right? So copyright is asserted as a reason why you can't just sort of freely share MP3 files of music over the internet. But it goes far beyond that, right? So derivative works rights, for example, claim that if I write a story that makes use of a character that was in a story you wrote, or if I do something that doesn't duplicate but imitates or modifies something that you did, and so I add my own labor to it without taking away anything that you've got, they claim that you as the original sort of copyright holder still have claims over me and still are able to veto what I'm trying to do or demand that I pay you off in order to get rid of your veto. And so it's portrayed as a way to, so I think, so like sort of basic labor-based or property, sort of things that are derived on the claim that this is like literally a form of labor-based property are not going to work at all, simply because the sort of the non-scarcity, the non-rivalry of intellectual products, so the basic nature of copying, is such that you're not actually losing any item of your labor that you ever had ownership of to begin with. It's just not how copying works. It doesn't destroy things. Like if I stole the copy of your book off your bookshelf, then of course that's a violation of property rights. But that's not what, sort of sharing an album or sharing a TV show on BitTorrent is. I'm not taking it away from anybody in order to share it. Now, there are a number of other arguments that are made, so even if it's not like literally a form of labor-based property, and even if we're not literally talking about theft in the sense of like depriving you of something that you had owned before, you'll get a class of arguments, almost all of which come down to sort of incentive-based arguments. And so you have the idea that if we don't have copyright terms that last for 70 to 90 years after the death of the author, if we don't have patents that last for decades, lock up new drug developments for decades and decades, that sort of we won't get enough stuff produced, like people who write songs or produce books or who do like research into drugs won't be able to make a profit. They won't be able to sort of recoup the effort if somebody jumps in and copies it. And there's a number of problems with these arguments. They tend to be fear-based rather than empirical. Like I just don't think there's very good evidence that the incentive problem they're pointing to exists. But I want to bracket that for a moment. They're all within the class of protectionist arguments. This is specifically exactly the kind of protectionist arguments that libertarians and even most non-libertarians, since sort of the fall of mercantilism, have very often like ridiculed. And so, if the notion is that the problem is that we're not going to have enough Justin Bieber songs because Justin Bieber can't sort of recoup enough money from the effort that goes into producing the song, well, there's going to be two questions. One is, how do you figure out how much is enough, right? It seems purely arbitrary to say that we have to have exactly the number of Justin Bieber songs we'll get if he keeps copyright until 90 years after his death. When, of course, that means people will spend more money on Justin Bieber songs. But there's no, sort of spending more money on some particular writer's songs rather than on food or on apartments or cars or any number of other things that people spend money on is not guaranteed to be any kind of gain. The other sort of point is just that even if you think it's obvious that the amount of an intellectual product that's produced isn't enough, like you want to, you want to have life-saving drugs, and you're worried that it's not going to be, enough of it isn't going to be produced by for-profit firms because they can't recoup the profits on their research. Well, then research will have to be done by not-for-profits, right? I mean, we have those. Universities do not-for-profit research. Sort of researchers who want to make a name or a reputation for themselves do not-for-profit research. And given sort of the overwhelming catastrophic humanitarian costs that are produced by locking up existing drugs for decades under patent restrictions, I think any kind of minimally humanitarian approach to questions of intellectual property is going to have to acknowledge that patent restrictions kill people, and sort of if the cost of not killing people right now in the world today is that university researchers have to figure out a way to work together better with pharmaceutical producers to get more basic research done on the not-for-profit side, and products put out at low cost through generics, then that's just the cost of being a decent human being and addressing addressing this sort of massive invasion of property, sort of massive invasion of rights of free competition that is having terrible effects throughout the world. One of the chief things that I'd want to say, especially when people sort of really begin to learn a lot about anarchist ideas and begin to learn about sort of the huge deformations that the state causes in our everyday lives, they get really excited about ideas of individual liberty and trying to bring about a healthier and freer society, is that they immediately start thinking of, how can I get involved, like, politically in order to do this? Like, who can I vote for? What kind of campaign can I jump in on? And that's an understandable impulse, because we've been sort of brought up in a society where you have sort of the civics textbook telling you that the way that you make social change is by producing political change, and the way that you produce political change is by sort of voting for your favorite candidate and sort of pounding the table and arguing with people at Thanksgiving over who they're going to vote for, and sort of participating within the system of sort of official channel electoral politics. And throughout the anarchist tradition, anarchists from sort of all over the spectrum have really wanted to emphasize how much this is a fundamental mistake. And it's not surprising it's a fundamental mistake, because you learn that from the civics textbook. The people who produce the civics textbook are part of the government system, right? They want you to take it for granted that the best channels for trying to improve, improve sort of the social conditions that you're living in is by sort of jumping in on and participating within the realm of political, sort of conventional political activism. And that's just untrue. The way to make change is typically not by sort of starting out sort of on the system's terms and trying to get new candidates elected, but rather to work through forms of not sort of political campaigning, but through forms of social activism that operate outside the system. So efforts just to talk with other people around you about sort of issues that you care about, or about anarchist ideas, to try and raise awareness and sort of aim at sort of cultural transformation. So, we have sort of a long history here, and politicians are kind of like like one of the most transformative movements just within my lifetime in terms of effects has been, in the United States, has been the gay liberation movement. From the time that I was first growing up to now, there's just been a complete sea change in attitudes. When we talk about the victories of gay liberation activism, we often talk about the stuff that just happened recently. So we talk about like Supreme Court decisions on gay marriage. We talk about earlier than that, sort of the wave of legislation on gay marriage and domestic partnership, or before that, Supreme Court decisions against striking down sodomy laws. And these are all really important developments, but they're not primarily developments that were brought about by electing better politicians. Lawrence's decision was made under George W. Bush, of all people. The recent decision on gay marriage was made under Barack Obama, who is perceived as was sort of elected as a pro-gay candidate, but wouldn't even sign on for gay marriage in 2008 when he was being voted for, right? And so politicians are really kind of the ultimate anti-hipsters, right? So like they got into gay marriage way after it was cool. And so what actually happened is that political changes like that are, when they come about, they're inevitably the product, they're sort of a lagging indicator, they're product of a long period of cultural transformation that ultimately makes it socially unsustainable for the state to go on trying to control people's lives and to sort of inflict damage on people in the ways that it traditionally has. And so that came about through a process of street demonstrations, of pride marches, of just individuals coming out. This was one of the most powerful factors, was just the movement to get LGBT people to come out to their family and to talk openly about sort of our lives and our sexualities with people who care about us. And So the sea change in social attitudes that took place throughout the 80s and the 90s and into the aughts is what made it possible and ultimately what made it necessary for any kind of government policy change to happen. And something that doesn't happen through ballot boxes and doesn't happen through political parties. It happens through sort of social activism, through face-to-face interaction, through protest, and through sort of just, you know, grassroots, person-to-person interacting and organizing in order to sort of exercise pressure or allow people simply to work around and ultimately make irrelevant sort of the oppressive policies of the state.